Hi everyone. My name is Wayne Jones. I'm a guest interviewer today on the Media Horror blog, which if you've been following that blog, that's a blog that writer Oscar Martens maintains. He also does interviews on that site, and he's just had a book published. So we thought obviously he couldn't be interviewing himself. So he asked me if I would be a guest interviewer here to interview him about the book that's just been published. So it's a book called No Call Too Small. It's a book of short stories, 13 stories published by Central Avenue Publishing just last month. Uh, and I'm going to ask some questions about the stories and about the book as a whole and about the process and everything. So the first question, Oscar, I want to ask is, and this is evident from the part in the book where you give some of the credits, these it's not as if you wrote all these stories in the last year and a half or something. These are all not recently written stories. Can you tell me a little bit about how they ended up in this collection?
Yeah, the collection spans about 18 years since my last book, and I guess it's pretty obvious that I'm a slow producer. Slow is part of my process. Sometimes I'll write a first draft and let it sit for a year. So yeah, it takes me a long time to put something together.
Yeah, and that other book you're talking about was published by Turnstone in '02. It was called The Girl with the Full Figure Is Your Daughter. Again, another collection of short stories that probably went through the same sort of thing, that had some had been accepted in literary journals and they were gathered together and that sort of thing, right?
That's right. And what I'm trying to do, I can write a story that I think is great, but usually I'm looking for some kind of external confirmation on that. And sometimes that will happen if it's picked up by a literary journal. And if it goes on to be nominated for some kind of prize. So a lot of those stories that have been published in literary journals are included in this collection. Actually, most of them. There's only a few that haven't been published previously in literary journals. And so that's kind of my method of trying to keep the quality of the collection at a high level.
And I also noticed from the credits that for this one, for No Call Too Small, not only were many of them published in literary journals, but some of them were nominated for the Journey Prize anthology and for other prizes as well, which is a decision that the editor would take because they see some extra value in the story that you've written.
That's right. And I think one of the stories was nominated for both a National Magazine Award and a Western Magazine Award. So yeah, I'm using that kind of as a external validator of the stories, and chose those ones to include in the collection.
How I'm curious about that. Like, do you could you see like in a collection including a story that didn't have that kind of external validation, or is that so important that you would never consider, say, a story that you'd written that maybe you never even published before, including that, or how does that work in your head that way?
Uh, I think there are certain stories where I'm going to take my cues from how people are reacting to it. Even if the story is rejected by journals, often there will be long notes from the editorial office. Some of them say this came close, or we had a big fight about this. So there's that's one way of looking at it. But I sometimes a story that has never been published and didn't get any good comments and wasn't nominated for any awards, I'm going to include that anyway, because I have a strong feeling about the quality of the story, and sometimes for whatever reason you're just not going to get a good response, and yeah, that's in those cases you just have to rely on your own instincts.
Yeah, which is obviously, well, and those instincts must be good if when you do get it published, the editors do see that kind of extra value in it. One of the things I wanted to say too is that these are stories now. The book has only been out for about a month or so. Excuse me. So these are stories that I've read over the past couple of weeks and I've been taking notes on them and that sort of thing. One of the things I really noticed about it, about the sort of, I was trying to think in my head, how do these all kind of feel, that sort of thing. And it had a very, the stories have a very, and this is a bit of an overstatement, but they have a very, I would call, anthropological feel about them, in the sense that they felt like someone like super objectively looking at something without making a judgment about it, without making a comment about it, without drawing the reader to draw some lesson from it or anything like that. It felt like something was presented and just left there like that. Is that something that you're conscious of in your writing or as a personal characteristic, or am I way off base there on that?
I don't know if that's a conscious urge on my part, but if that's the way you see it, I'm glad it turned out that way. I think we both know how terrible fiction can be when you attempt to insert some kind of theme, or a piece becomes political. Maybe all pieces are political these days, but yeah, I'm glad that that's how you experienced it, because that sounds pretty pure to me.
Yeah, no, and me too. And it made me think earlier, made me think just in the last couple of days as I was putting my notes together. There's a great, I think it's a short novel published, I don't know, sometime in the 70s or 80s by a writer named Ray Smith called Lord Nelson Tavern. And in that story, one of his characters, they talk about fiction and things like that. And I always remembered this line. Someone says about, I think they're talking about Jane Austen, and they're thinking, Jane Austen, how is that relevant to today, kind of thing. And the retort on the part of the person in support of that was, because, and here's the quote, it was closely observed and accurately rendered. And I thought, and that's how I felt about your stories. I felt that things were observed extremely closely. And this is everything from, grand life to down to what happens when you take a sledgehammer to a Ferris wheel, kind of thing. Like very small to the very large. They were very closely observed and accurately rendered. And does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's the direction any writer would want to go with that. That sounds good.
And the other thing I noticed too is that and this is something that personally I like in fiction, uh, and it's a hard thing to bring across. But there's like simultaneously for me there felt like a real spareness uh, to the writing certainly, and to the sentiments as well. But at the same time, a kind of exuberance about it too. A certain, it's not as if it's so spare that it feels like like a writing exercise or something. What's the most you can say in 100 words or something? But it's at the same time very spare but very evocative. Is that something that you're aware of when you're writing, that you're trying to always, in a way, mush it down to the something that's very compact and hard? Does that make any sense? Resonate with you?
I think in some ways it connects up to the issue of being underwritten or overwritten. And I've never been prone to having paragraphs and paragraphs of description, a minute description of someone's house or someone's character or someone's appearance. I've never done that, and I think sometimes that I should do more of that, but it is just not the kind of writer that I am. And I'm thinking about when you are on the bus or something and you overhear two people behind you talking. I mean, it's not necessary for you to have a detailed description of anything, but just the particular things that they're mentioning, the particular details. I mean, that's what makes it something that you're really interested in, or a fragment of a conversation you hear as you're walking along on a hiking trail. That can be enough. I mean, if there's enough energy in that fragment, well, that can lead to a whole an entire story. So I guess it's a different approach, and yeah, I definitely am relying on the reader to fill in a lot of the blanks in their imagination, which I think is a process that's pretty automatic to us all.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's not as if, like I say, I felt that this is a weird minimalism that I don't understand what's happening here, because the other thing of what you said, you're quite right that you can make a story from a detail kind of thing, but the other thing is that you don't need, often one doesn't need, and often a writer doesn't need uh, 10 and a half pages of something describing a room in order to evoke that room kind of thing. Some telling details of things will be all you really need. And also, maybe the room is irrelevant. Maybe the details in the room are irrelevant to what's happening. I sometimes wonder, and I wonder if you do as well, whether you think that's a personal liking, or do you, in the sense that you don't want to read descriptions of what the carpet was like, and what kind of dresser and their television and stuff like that, or do you think that that's something that's that your method is just as valid as it were, kind of thing? I guess what I'm saying is that, do you think that your method is different, or do you feel that it's one among many that people either like or dislike in fiction?
Um, I'm not sure whether it's my method is better or inferior to anyone else's, but I think we both had the experience where you're reading through the latest prize winner, and you're on to page 3 or 4, and you're not really feeling it. You're waiting for, when is it going to begin? You're wondering, why is all this detail brought in? You want something that grabs you right away in the first few paragraphs and doesn't let go. So that's kind of what I'm aiming for. Uh, I think we've had conversations about this before, but I don't have the patience for a chapter that didn't go well, especially if that's the first chapter in your book and you did not construct it in a way to make me want to continue. So people talk about getting halfway through a book before it starts to get going. Well, that's way too forgiving, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't make it that. I wouldn't make it that far either. Yeah, and the other thing I've always wondered about that is this whole business of, uh, in a certain kind of way, and this is not a question, this is not a comment necessarily about what's better or what's worse kind of thing, but in a certain way, you could view it that it's a very simplistic way to look at it for a writer, say, to say, well, in order to describe this room, I have to go through all the walls and everything, and say everything that's here. And maybe there are certain readers who need that in order to for it to evoke something for them. You often hear people saying things like, "Oh, I could smell that lasagna kind of thing," or I really felt I could be there. And maybe people um, need the full description. They need the description of the crust on the lasagna and stuff like that. Maybe they need all that in order to feel that. But I can say, in your stories, and for me as a person, I not only do I not need that, but I do not want that. I will not go through pages of descriptions of the various cheeses that go into the lasagna. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. And part of it, I think, is there may be readers who require that level of detail, but my first reader of my work is me, and I've got to like it. If I don't like it, I am not continuing with revisions. So maybe that's kind of selfish and self-centered, but yeah, I'm the first reader of my stuff. So it's definitely going to have to maintain my interest for a process of revisions that might take months or a year even.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Obviously, the other thing I wanted to say is a sort of a subset of that about the minimalist feel is that there's also, I think it's fair to say, at least in most of the stories or in the book as an aggregate, there's very little dialogue that happens. Like there's, and it felt to me, I just occurred to me now, it feels like, you know, there are certain people that don't talk very much, but when they do say something, you really listen because they only speak up when they have something to say. If you take that as an analogy, I felt that way about your book as a whole. There wasn't much dialogue, but I was always very attuned to the fact that when there was some dialogue, I'd better listen to it, if you know what I mean. That it was important because it was so rare. Does that first, does that make sense in what I'm saying? And also, is that a conscious thing? Is that a are you avoiding dialogue because you feel the other part of the prose is more important, quote unquote? Can you say a few things about that?
I I guess I am avoiding dialogue in places. I have a measure where I, I'm wondering, does this have to be dialogue? And if it doesn't have to be dialogue, then it's not going to be. So I'm looking for the certain things that you have to hear in direct speech, and hopefully those short fragments are going to have a lot of power. I mean, I'm sure you've read books where there's pages and pages of dialogue, and I think that's easy to read. It flows well, um, but that's not what I'm after. Um, yeah, and maybe it can be considered a little bit dense sometimes, but I don't mind if I'm slowing someone down to get everything they can out of the text.
Yeah, no, and it does feel dense in that sense of the word of being compact. Definitely, it does have that feel to it. Uh, I want to apologize a little for the next question because this is probably a common question that you may have been asked before in some kind of venue, but I'm very curious about for any writer their method basically. Uh, I write myself. I write things myself as well, and I talk any writer that I meet. I always am very curious about their method. There's sort of the dump method where basically a lot of writers they just spill out 150,000 words into the word processor and then go in and pare it all down kind of thing. And then there's the linear, the kind of like the combine harvester people who they start at a sentence and they make their way down. And by the time they get to 60,000 words, they don't have to fix much of what they've already written. There's that style of writer. There's also a style, and I'm not saying this is a definitive list, but there's also a style of people who there's a certain word you were talking about, people talking on a bus or something, and you overhear them. There's a certain phrase, and that'll just inspire something into you that will spill something out of you. I'm wondering how you proceed with your stories. Maybe there are different methods for different stories. Maybe you don't have a method kind of thing, but maybe you can say something a little bit about how it comes together that an idea for a story ends up on a page and you're satisfied with
Yeah, the initial spark or idea can come from anywhere. Like we were talking about that overheard conversation on the bus, and there was a while back. I was walking along a hiking trail, and then there's a couple approaching me, and the woman just said 1.6, and I knew that being in Vancouver, she was talking about her house. Whether that was the asking price or the selling price, it didn't matter. But I mean, there was a lot packed into that 1.6. That hasn't turned into a story, but it could. And so the initial idea phase, I find that you might get ideas when it is most inconvenient. I get ideas a lot of times when I'm not in range of a pen or pencil. I get ideas in the shower. because that's a really inconvenient time to get an idea that you don't want to lose before you can write it down. Or simple things like if you got some kind of mindless physical task that you're doing, such as weeding in the garden, or if you're out for a run, 60 to 70% of your body or your mind is taken up on moving around and being aware of the world, and there's that other section that is free to kind of roam and is kind of, you're distracted, so you're thinking clearly in a way. But beyond the initial ideas, I put my ideas in an idea folder. They usually know whether they want to be poems or stories or screenplays or novels. And I let them sit there, and sometimes they will not get out of that folder if they can't excite me to the level where I think I got to write this now. Or I might just not have the capability to write the story at the time, or there's something missing there that might come in a little later. It might not ever make it out of that file. But I'm really impressed you're talking about some of those other people who start just one sentence at a time, write their masterpiece. I think that's incredible. It's definitely not anything to do with my process. I just want to get a first draft down, and I realize it's going to be garbage, and I would be embarrassed to have it released in that form. But by the time I'm done, maybe there's not an original word left in the whole thing. Maybe every word of 5,000 words has been replaced by a better sentence. And it's super inefficient. And I think we've talked about before, like you're closer to one of those writers who can just take your time and write sentence by sentence and have something fairly decent at the end of that. That's not the case for me. I'm an insane amount of revisions, just until sometimes there's nothing left of the original.
Yeah, so that makes in a certain way that makes intuitive sense that for fiction that ends up like this fiction has ended up, where it's extremely tight and extremely dense in the good sense of the word, and extremely compact. It's hard to imagine that that could come out like this. And it's also hard to imagine that, let's say one of the stories has 2,000 words in it, that started as a story with 18,000 words or something, and you just put it down. So it makes sense what you're saying, that we just, in a way, roll it over and roll it over and roll it over. And suddenly you, or not suddenly, but in the end, you come up with something that you're content with.
We've spoken in the past about how do you measure your progress so over the course of a writing day, and I'm in hours and you're in words because maybe I wrote 2,000 words and then deleted them all. So what's my word count for the day? 0. But it's a very different process.
That may be where I was getting paid by the word. So, I produce 200 words, I get my $200 no matter what happens. No, the other thing I noticed too about the book, I got some specific questions I want to ask, but the other thing I noticed about the book as a whole too is that, and it often sort of sneaked up on me, because there's a lot of humor in the book. Like there's a couple of stories that are flat out written as comical stories, if I can put it that way, by which I don't mean in a derogatory way at all. Comedy is often harder to write than whatever the opposite of comedy is, real life, I guess. But there's a lot of humor in there, and is that something? I guess two things. Is that something that you felt that you were consciously, and I'm sorry for saying it this way, inserting into your stories, or is it something that sort of came out of them and you felt sort of balanced against? Because a lot of the stories are also super serious and dark in some ways, that you felt balanced that a bit more, if you know what I'm saying.
There's never really been an attempt from me to insert some humor because something is a little too dark. all of that is occurring organically. If it is funny, then it's because it was naturally occurring. Like, part of the problem is that I may find things funny that other people don't. For example, you take a movie like the original Fargo, which I thought was hilarious in many places. It's very dark, very violent, but I mean, there's so much humor in there, and I'm laughing, but everyone else is like not laughing. I guess it's kind of a matter of your subjective taste. So I don't know if that really answers your question or not.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. And I, you know, as I was asking the question, it's hard to imagine a serious writer, you know, say semi-finishing a story and saying, "Hey, I have to insert some humor into this," kind of thing. It just doesn't work that way, right? Yeah. So I had a few things I wanted to do. I've got some. Went through. I wanted to do a little experiment with you. I've gone through some of the stories, and I just wanted to hear some specific comments because as I was reading through, there's some passages in the stories, and I'm not even going to mention the titles, that really struck me, either because they're funny or because they were revelatory for the story, or there was a certain choice of words, and one especially where there was a certain rhythm about it that I found very kind of affecting. And I just wanted to go through those, and you can either say 3 words about it or say, "Yep, I wrote that," or whatever you want to comment, and I might have something to say about them as well. So uh, I really like the title story because it describes like a town where there's not really much going on. So basically, you take the structure of, say, if these were cops in New York City, there'd be, you know, lots of stuff to, you know, the suspect would be a drug dealer or a prostitute, or there's a murder taking place. But I've got this in front of me now, the story, and it's where the guy, where the someone is saying to the other person, and this is a direct quote from your story. There's there's a scribe describing 2 squirrels. Subject is a few inches tall, half a pound, light brown fur, bushy tail, nervous, darting eyes, and a twitchy body language. I find that very funny. And but the great thing about it for me is that I guess the 2 things that stand out, the 3 things. One is that, I mean, laughter is one of those things that you can't deny. If it happens, you find it funny. But the other thing about it is that it it illustrates something about that small town in that kind of way. But the other thing is that there's language in there that would be applicable to New York as well. If someone had darting eyes or was a bit twitchy, you know, that could be indicative as well. So that's what I found the beauty of it, that you were indicating what it's like in a small town, but actually using the some of the lingo that would be quite appropriate to New York City as well. Uh, what are your comments? Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a pretty slow day in Port Moody if the squirrel is the chief suspect. Um, yeah, the whole title of the thing, "No Call Too Small," it initially struck me as a quite hilarious thing. I thought it was just for the Port Moody Police Department, their particular thing, but it's North American wide. It's the notion that there is no crime that's too small to report, and you got your iPhone stolen, you should call it in because maybe we'll catch a guy with a stolen car, and guess what? Inside there is your cell phone, and isn't this great? But when I initially read about that, I kind of thought, like, you know, the attitude is, please call us. We're so bored. There's no crime in this district, and you can see it. I think you can just imagine what it's like for some of these police departments, because I think Port Moody is like that. I don't think there's a lot of serious crime, but 22 kilometers to the west is the downtown east side, where there's people overdosing like crazy on fentanyl, and you don't you're trying to use protocols not to touch them, and there's all these drug gangs and people are shooting up right in front of you. So I mean, I guess I was trying to kind of illustrate how slow this police department was. Probably totally unfair to the police department of Port Moody, but that's the story that I imagined.
Yeah, no, it's very funny. And actually, like I say, there's a lot of these stories are very, I don't know what the proper word is, serious kind of thing. But so when the humor comes along like that, it's really very striking. And that's another thing actually about the reading, because what we were talking about earlier about the some writers who write short stories or novels that are, that turn out to be novels, say, that turn out to be 550 pages long. I'm not sure, like I've read these stories slowly. Maybe it's just because my 60-year-old brain is as fast as I can go, but I've read these stories very slowly. And I think that you can't read a 550-page novel slowly. You kind of have to go through it. It has to be turning the pages. And I think where I'm trying to get to is that I think if you apply the same method of reading a 550-page novel as you do to reading one of your stories, I think there will be things missed. I think your eyes will kind of just go over it, and you won't be kind of that reader will be noticing excellencies in it if they're applying the same method as they would with the 550-page novel. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I think that's going to be the case with a condensed, compact product like that. Maybe you're used to reading material at a certain pace, and then but you can't really do it in some cases because there's more there, and hopefully there are more layers to discover. So yeah, I guess it's all a matter of determining, what kind of writing you're reading and adjusting your pace accordingly, because you're not going to be able to fly through it like some kind of 800-word internet article.
Right. The next quote that I have is from a story where you make reference to Jim Rockford, who was this was a TV series in the 70s, 80s, something like that. And he used to live in a trailer, I think, right? And you're describing, you're basically in a way speculating about if he were to have a woman over, kind of thing. And here's the sentence. So imagine his date stepping inside, clutching her purse a little tighter, hoping that when her eyes adjust to the darkness, her grim expectations will be proven wrong. So that's at the same time very funny, but it also indicates something about, she's out on a date with this guy who's a very successful private investigator or whatever he was, but he's living in a trailer, and she wants to open up and see that when she goes in, that it's very different from this, what appears to be the reality. I again found that very funny, but also very I sort of felt for, in a certain sense, the date, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I like that passage, and a bit of it is that these guys, you can tell from the tone and the way they're discussing that this is something that comes up on a daily basis. They have completely dissected every cop movie and every cop show, and it's also an indicator of the slackness of their job, that this is what they do all day, and this is what they're concerned with, and so it kind of serves a dual purpose in that way.
Yeah. The next passage I'm going to quote is where this one really, and this was also very striking, where I'm reading along, and then this is something that is extremely scientific about uh, it's either rain or a hurricane or something like that. And I thought, and it's again, it's that kind of language that where to refer back to the mythical 550-page novel, you might just sort of skip over it and not really take it in. But once you take it in, there's a certain rhythm to what you've written here and a certain accuracy that I found quite affecting. So I'm going to read that passage. Somehow, somewhere in that gray stewing mass, vapor bonds with dust and droplets are born, joining into heavier drops that blow apart when they hit the hood of the car. The fragments are reabsorbed into a blob, and when the mass overwhelms surface tension, it bursts into a rivulet, a tiny vein-like stream that joins others as they flow down the slope toward the ground. That is like a scientific analysis of something very small that's happening, basically. And just tell me something about that. Say something about that.
That's just an indication of how messed up this guy is from recent experiences that have happened. There's so much has happened in the past couple of minutes. There's so many decisions that have to be made now. His brain is slowing down, and he's just observing this phenomena of nature, and it's more indicative of his mental state at the time. He's just kind of frozen and stunned. And if you called his name at that point, he wouldn't respond because he's just kind of like slack jawed and staring at this thing happening because he's overwhelmed.
Right. Okay. Well done, though. I again found that very affecting. And here's another one that's uh, there's a lot of things. Maybe it's just my attitude towards life. I find everything in a way very serious and very funny at the same time. So your book of stories is perfect for something. So here's the quote. More likely, he's a smug little gangster growing weed in a mold-filled basement or running a few phone sex lines, drawing out middle-aged ejaculate in dark rooms across the city. Uh, That's beautiful, dark, and funny all at the same time. There's a certain rhythm to that that's really perfect. But of course, what's being described is you know, for those characters, I mean, it's the pathetic actions that they're involved in. Say a little bit about that one.
Maybe not very realistic because I've been informed that the Hells Angels run all the phone sex lines, and if you try to start your own phone sex line, it will lead to a bad result. But I don't know. No, that wasn't your real point. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that one.
Okay, it's good. It's really really struck me. I don't know. It's the whole thing, I guess. The funniness, and again, it's amazing, kind of in a way to me, how much humor there is, either as flat out humor, but either as a kind of an attitude in a lot of these stories. The humor about uh, you know. Uh, drying out middle-aged ejaculate. I mean, there's something funny about that. There's something a little punny about that as well, and I thought that was pretty fantastic. So, and here's one where you often hear, we've both done writers classes 700 years ago, kind of thing, and people always talk about the telling detail on something where you go, that is exactly right. And there's just this say a portion of a sentence. The wonky bottom drawer that she must jerk, twist, and pummel.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension, I guess, sexual tension in that, and I'm thinking of the people who try to get things done by force, and those who just know like, just the right angle to twist this and turn this a little bit. And I know how this drawer works. You can just lift this up a bit, and then you don't have to. So I'm comparing how they're um, negotiating with the physical world to how they would be sexually, I guess, is what I'm saying there.
Yeah, no, it's well done. And even without the sexual part or the analogy or the comparison, the whole business of, for me, what I took from it was the contrast between, let's say, what you see on television, where all dressers and bureaus, you just pull it out like this and you go in and your socks are there and you close it. But a lot of the furniture that I grew up with anyway, you had to sort of do this with it and pull it up. There's like a magic sort of way of getting it open kind of thing. And that's what I got from it. That immediately struck me that things don't pull out like this and then you take things and push it back in. So that was very evocative for me. So, um, and here's another quote. Of course, a life can fall apart, but it's the speed of it that's dizzying. Kat and Wendy are the same. For years, you make contributions, and then you have a little rough spot, and suddenly you're shit in their eyes. Everything you built, everything you did is nothing.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a familiar story for people in a marriage. You did all the right things. You're proceeding down a traditional path, and after it breaks down, everything changes. You're the villain. You don't get credit for what you helped create, and it's just fallen apart in a very rapid way.
And I want to move to that to again, I guess you could call it funny kind of thing. It's hard to, when you have an odd sense of humor, it's hard to say something is funny because other people will look at you and say, "What do you mean that's funny?" But there you have a great story um, where a partner has gone to Milan and her partner is taking care of her daughter, and her daughter happens to have her period for the first time, and the partner that's there taking care is trying to deal with it because the girl is the teenager is freaking out and everything. And I liked how logical it is in a certain way. In a certain way, that's a very, I don't know, common situation, but it's something I've seen in film. It's something I've read in books before, where what do you do? There's a scramble kind of thing. But here's here's the exchange, and my reaction here was because the person who's taking care of the girl doesn't give all the information, or uh, because that person is in a scramble too. When the girl hears it, when the teenager hears it, she goes, anyway, I'll just read it. So the partner of the person who's in Milan says, the bleeding will stop in a few days. And the girl says, a few days? I'll be dead by then. And I thought that was perfect because, of course, yes, it will stop in a few days. But if you can just imagine someone who doesn't know anything about the process and you tell them they're going to be bleeding for 4 days, they're just imagining the worst. So at the same time that the person is trying to reassure the girl, accidentally, because the words are not carefully chosen, it's freaked her out and she thinks she's going to die, kind of thing. It was extremely, extremely well done in two lines of dialogue, kind of thing. So
Well, thanks. Yeah, just imagine what a 12 or 13-year-old girl, if she had lived on a desert island on her own for as long as she could remember, what she gonna think, when she first gets her period. It's bizarre and freaky, and a lot of it is. I had a lot of fun with this story because I think about what a terrible parent I would be. It's just, there's so much to negotiate and to handle, uh, to dealing with someone who's growing up, and just things like trying to give counsel to some young person when you have no clue. Like, I often think about, what I would tell my kid if they were confronted by a bully at school, and I don't even know what the official consensus party line politically correct thing to do is, but you could tell them to ignore the bullying, and it'll eventually stop, or you could tell them to punch them in the face as hard as you can, and these are both viable solutions, and I can't say which one would be more effective, but uh, I think it kind of explains why it's a very good thing that I'm not a parent.
I'm not a parent either, but I've talked to a lot of people who are parents. I have two brothers who are married, and I've talked to, I used to have a lot of workmates who were married as well and had kids. And the one thing I heard is that uh, this is way overstating it, but no one knows what they're doing. It's not as if you become a parent and suddenly the guidebook is infused into you and you know what you're doing. So it's like everything else in life. No one knows what they're doing, really, right?
Yes, that is one part of it that's somewhat terrifying. The really terrifying part is that this young person might listen to what you're saying and accept it as truth and act on it. And maybe you told them a very bad thing to do, and maybe you told them to go about it the wrong way. But that's the other side of it.
Yeah, right. I guess that's where racism comes from, right? If you end up growing up with parents who are telling you that another race is inferior, um, you think of that as the truth, right? So just a couple more, and then I just want to sort of finish up. But I really like this. I like. There's a lot of great contrast in a lot of the stories, and there's one story where a janitor accidentally gets confused as the new principal that's coming into the school, and this I think this is a scene from may not even involve the janitor, but anyway, it's in the I think it's in the teacher's lounge, but I love the contrast between this whole spiegel of stuff, and then what the reply is to it. So I'll try to read it. So they're in the teacher's lounge, and someone is saying, "Did anyone watch that new show last night? It's the one with the interviews at the start, and then there are people who are being interviewed, put on boxing gloves, and duke it out in the ring. I forget the name. It's a stupid name. Sharon, you know the one I'm talking about, right?" And Sharon says, "I don't watch television." That's very funny because there's the contrast between as I took it anyway, there's a certain smugness about people who insist they don't watch television, or there used to be anyway, when television was terrible. It's not that it's improved a whole lot, but and then the person who's all giddy about the latest stupid show that involves boxing this and some, you can just imagine it as a show. And so I just love that contrast between someone being giddily excited about you watch that show, and then someone saying, "I don't watch television." Thought that was really, really effectively done.
Yeah, there's a definite class division, and it keeps on popping out through the story. And there's another part where he's talking with the teachers in the teacher lounge, and he talks about that truck I saw in the corner. I seen that truck. I seen that truck, which is fine for most people, and we understand what you're saying. But for this group of teachers, it's kind of like, really?
And this one kind of comes with a kind of a spoiler alert. So if anyone is listening to this interview and you don't want to know the ending to the one about the story called The Janitor, this is the ending, and the guy's name is Carl. And it ends up, the story goes into various very funny things, very serious things. There's a lot of satire in this story as well. But the end part, basically, he ends up in the gym playing basketball, trying to make a shot. And the rhythm of this sentence I thought was really, apart from the content, the rhythm of it is something that felt to me like someone had worked on. And here's the sentence, and I hope I can do it justice. Carl pounded the ball into the floor in time with his heart, and he saw the ball go down. No backboard, no rim. He saw the ball go down before it even left his hands. And of course, the repetition, that repetition thing there is very, in a certain way, that's what kind of makes it. But also the whole thing about if people, for those who have read that story and relate back to it, but that's a really, for me, that's a beautifully written sentence that has a kind of rhythm about it that in a certain way, it doesn't really matter what you're saying. There's that rhythm of the repetition kind of sells it right there.
Yeah, that's the last time we see him, and I think this is something that's a feature of our culture, that if you're losing in life, winning at a game can have a disproportionate effect.
And my point was more though that the about the words as words kind of thing, there you could have it could be phrased in a very different way, but for me he saw the bell go down. A writer choosing to say that twice in a short sentence like that, there's a reason for that, and that's more what I was kind of getting at, and that's a choice you made obviously because you must have thought it was necessary. It conveyed something that without it would not be there. So anyway, that's all. That's maybe I can go on record and say that's my favorite sentence in the whole book. I could say that. So anyway, thanks for this, Oscar. I just wanted to say for people who are wanting to buy the book, it's called No Call Too Small. It's had some really excellent reviews, including a really great write-up in Publishers Weekly. Uh, and again, I found myself slowing down when I was reading. I really felt that I couldn't just page turner it kind of thing. I really felt slowed down to it. You can get the book on Amazon. It's published by Central Avenue Publishing. You can get it there. It's available in paperback and in electronic form. Thanks for the interview. Good luck with sales, and we'll talk again.
Thanks very much for the interview. If anyone wants to further information about me, you can go to my website, www.oscarmartens.com.
Thanks, Oscar. Bye.
Bye.